The Great Patriotic War began on June 22, 1941. When it ended 4 years later, 27 million Soviet citizens were dead and thousands of Soviet cities, towns, and villages were in ruins. The victory over fascism became the defining event of the entire Soviet experience. Military parades and imposing monuments typically glorified the men whose sacrifices had liberated Europe from fascism. But what about the womanly face of the Great Patriotic War? Proclaiming that it had liberated the working class, the Soviet state was also the first in the world to give full legal equality and citizenship to women. A counterpart to the new Soviet man, the new Soviet woman was to embody the revolution's values while taking on numerous roles: a citizen of the Soviet Union, a worker dedicated to building socialism, and to be sure, a wife and mother, roles that were increasingly emphasized under the socially conservative Joseph Stalin. Faced with catastrophic losses during the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet regime expanded the role of women in the armed forces. Ultimately, some 800,000 Soviet women were put into uniform. While most served in medical units, women pilots took part in thousands of combat missions. Of particular note are the more than 2,000 Soviet women who were deployed as snipers, including Lyudmila Pavlichenko, credited with killing 309 Axis soldiers. Women were also prominent in the partisan movement, which consisted of bands of irregulars who resisted Nazi occupation by making life miserable and often deadly for German soldiers in Soviet territory. One such partisan was 18-year-old Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, who the Germans had captured burning down houses in a village where they had taken refuge from the cold. Arrested, tortured, and hanged by the occupiers, Zoya became the country's most recognizable martyr and the embodiment of resistance. Even if most Soviet women did not serve in a military capacity during the Great Patriotic War, few could escape the shocking conditions of life during wartime: bombing raids, a brutal occupation, constant hunger, the loss of loved ones, rape. As fighting-age men were conscripted into the Soviet army, women were needed more than ever to work in the factories and to take positions of responsibility in the administration of the Soviet state. The most dramatic change was on the collective farms. Drained of able-bodied workers and barely able to feed the country even in peacetime, by the war's end, more than 4 out of 5 collective farmers were women, whose backbreaking labor prevented mass starvation. The hardships continued after the war, as the loss of more than 9 million soldiers made widows of untold numbers of women in a country where women of reproductive age faced an alarming deficit of potential partners. Politically marginalized and now discouraged from pursuing a military career, it fell largely to Soviet women to rebuild a country that had lost a generation of its young men. While a cult of the Great Patriotic War glorified the feats of the victorious Red Army, the stories of Soviet women during and after the war faded into the background, until the publication in the 1980s of a book titled The Unwomanly Face of War by the Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich. Based on the oral testimonies of Soviet war veterans, this book was the first to convey the experiences of the women who served and fought during the Great Patriotic War.